Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Crash Course World History. Today we're talking about, oh look, African kingdoms. What a surprise. Why is that a surprise, you might ask? Well, we all remember the amazing ancient Egypt civilization many years ago, but we have to remember one important thing. Africa is huge, and Egypt is only a little country on the big African continent. So African kingdoms didn't really start developing until around the 4th or 5th century, which is when Africa chose to play catch-up, while the rest of the world was already making great contributions to our society's culture, like metallurgy, architecture, and alphabet. So Africa, since you took so long to develop big kingdoms, your contributions better be some dang good ones. Before most of the large kingdoms emerged, there were a large group of city-states that developed on the East Coast. Around the early 10th or 11th centuries is when the Swahili city-states emerged, and they brought tremendous wealth to the coastal regions of eastern Africa. The Swahili city-states were composed of the Bantu-speaking peoples who settled into the lives of farmers, merchants, and fishermen. The name Swahili comes from the Arabic word for coasters or traders. Since they were along the east coast of Africa, it was kind of hard for them to use the trans-Saharan trade route. Instead, they decided to use the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean. This allowed them to trade with Muslims beginning in the early 10th century. Like many other African kingdoms, they were able to bring gold, slaves, and ivory to the African coast. So way to go, Africa! Finally, you're really connected with the rest of the world. Each city-state was governed by a king, who strengthened their hold on their communities by controlling and taxing trade within their jurisdictions. These port cities, which include Mogadishu, Lamu, Lamindi, Kilwa, etc., received impressive transformations. By the 12th century, they were built out of core materials and boasted some stone mosques and public buildings. The people were even wealthy enough to wear silk garments. Talk about a comfortable lifestyle, huh? The wealth that their city-states generated allowed for great kingdoms to emerge, like Ghana, Mali, Songhai, and Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, the Swahili city-states came to a decline about the 15th century. It was really in the 4th and 5th centuries that the Kingdom of Ghana became a wealthy powerhouse in West Africa. They started out like many other kingdoms as an agricultural society, and it wasn't until a Spanish explorer, Al-Bukhari, established the principal trading site at Kumbili Saleh that they were integrated into the sub-Saharan trade network. For almost 5 centuries, Ghana continued to expand, eventually encompassing the region between the Senegal and Niger rivers. Apparently, Africa likes to be slow and steady, because it was in the 10th century that Muslim influence reached Ghana. It was the principal state of West Africa at that time, and when the kingdom converted to Islam, the new relations with Muslim merchants from North Africa and nomads greatly increased the already flourishing trade network. Unfortunately, the empire didn't stand much longer afterwards, though, because them being more lenient and less forceful caused raids from the north to slip through and overwhelm them. Ghana dissolved completely by the 13th century. Maybe they could have done a little bit better, but kudos for trying, Africa. Almost exactly the same time as the Swahili city-states, the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe was being nurtured into the area between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers in East Africa as well. The city was named after their large buildings constructed out of granite blocks stacked tightly together, its meaning being stone dwelling in the Shona language. Their magnificent buildings included stone towers, palaces, and public structures. What's really impressive, though, is that most of the construction at Zimbabwe was completely and 100% original African building. Historians do believe there is a small amount of contact with other regions on the subject, but not much. What was most likely the main source of all of Great Zimbabwe's economic power was their position as the center of gold and ivory trade. This made them an ideal place for travelers and merchants to trade at, as well as bringing extreme amounts of wealth to the city. Merchants came from regions as far as China, Persia, and Syria just to get in on the action. Besides of all the trade going on in and around Zimbabwe, most of the occupants participated in cattle herding and agriculture. They were all doing fine until Mother Nature decided she had enough of that. The environmental degradation was a big issue in the area during the later centuries. This was partially the reason for decline later, but it can also be blamed on gold trade decline and the scarcity of usable land and water resources. Also, Portuguese merchants disrupted the local trading posts. So it's okay, Africa, it wasn't all your fault. Zimbabwe was a great nation and lasted many centuries, and the ruins are still visible today. Next in line to be a power in Africa was the Great Mali Empire in West Africa. Though several successor states took portions of Ghana's territory, political leadership mainly went straight to the Mali, which emerged right as the Ghana Empire declined. The capital, Niamey, attracted many merchants and benefited even more than Ghana from trans-Saharan trade. The rulers of Mali also honored Islam, and they provided protection, lodging, and comfort for Muslim merchants, but it was not forced on their people. Mali was also the empire in which Sundayada, or the Lion Prince, reigned from 1230 to 1255. He was the ruler who expanded the empire to include not only Ghana, but also the regions surrounding the former state. Basically, he was a cripple that was completely underestimated by his enemies, and they definitely regretted letting him live. Sundayada brought up the Mali Empire and set a great standard for rulers to come. This shows that you don't have to be perfect to establish an empire. He was a cripple. How cool is that? After Sundayada, his grandnephew Mansa Musa brought Mali to its high point. He observed Islamic traditions by making his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, which created a great inspiration for his subjects. It was during this trip and his 3-month visit to Cairo that Mansa Musa distributed so much gold that the metal's value declined as much as 25% in local markets and created an issue with inflation. On his return, he established religious schools in Mali, bringing in Arabian and North African teachers, including 4 descendants of Muhammad himself, to increase the Islamic knowledge in Mali. Afterwards, the amount of gold he required made him the richest man to ever have lived. So even though he had to go through all of the sweat and tears of traveling the Sahara Desert, it kind of paid off. Literally. Take that, Bill Gates. Even with all of his efforts, though, Africa must have had some bad luck because the Mali Empire declined extremely quickly afterwards. They were forced to make way for the Songhai, which would control the region for many centuries. Located in West Africa on the Niger River, the Songhai Empire began when Sani Ali Ber came to power and conquered the once powerful Mali Empire as well as Timbuktu. Sani Ali established the largest empire in West Africa. At the capital in Gao, an amazing cosmopolitan marketplace flourished where koala nuts, golden slaves, spices, palm oil, and precious woods were traded. Just like Ghana and Mali, the Songhai Empire also became faithful to traditional Islam. They had centralized ruling too, where the subjects paid their taxes to the king and all of the larger states belonged to the nobles. Wealthier citizens had slaves, but unlike other empires, they also used slaves for soldiers and military power. The army used spears, arrows, leather and copper shields, as well as other forms of weaponry. The Songhai Empire also put emphasis on educational values. The Songhai Empire aided in helping Timbuktu become a major cultural center that was complete with a university that drew scholars from around the Islamic world. The university was called the Sankor, and it was expanded by Ashika, who is the most important emperor of the Songhai Empire. Now there is a university added in Africa. Way to go from agricultural migrations to having a sophisticated education. He centralized the bureaucracy, established Sharia law throughout the empire, and built numerous schools. All good things must come to an end, though, and after being invaded by the Moroccans during the Civil War in 1591, they never re-established Shanghai's glory. Other empires in Africa did attempt to continue traditions from this empire, but never strong enough to return that region to its high point. Wow, so African societies and kingdoms did make some really good contributions to our world after all. If you didn't notice it before, some of the similarities that all the kingdoms/societies shared were that they participated in agriculture and were involved in trade, which both brought a lot of wealth to the kingdoms and societies. Trade was the key that allowed large kingdoms and societies to develop in West Africa as well as East Africa. Trade also allowed Africans to come in contact with Muslims on the Sahara trade routes when they were searching for salt. This allowed Islam to enter Africa, which is what connected Africa to the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere. Oral literature and communication was also an important part of African culture, as well as trade. A lot of the information on African kingdoms and societies isn't certain. That's because Africans passed down most of their information orally instead of writing it down. Yes, I know that kind of makes our lives as students harder and historians, but in the end, it was really good for the Africans because it made their culture unique, especially when combined with Islam. So the combination of agriculture production, trade, and their unique culture combined with Islam supported the development of large societies and kingdoms around the Sahara and below the Sahara. So that's it for Crash Course this week. See you next week.